The morning of the auction rose over the town with a pale and uneasy light, and Clara felt as if the sun itself hesitated to shine on the cruelty waiting for her. The dusty street was lined with people who had gathered not out of kindness but out of hunger for spectacle and gossip. Their eyes followed her as the sheriff pushed her forward, and their whispers crawled across her skin like cold fingers. She had lost her husband only a week ago, and though they had never shared a gentle life, she still felt the shock of his sudden death. Yet there was no time to grieve, for the law declared that his debts were now hers to bear, and the townspeople were eager to see her sold as payment for the reckless choices he had made. She wore the same faded dress she had used while tending to him in his last days, but now it only marked her as a debtor, a burden, and a woman with no power to defend herself. Sheriff marched her to the wooden platform set up in the center of the street. His voice boomed through the air as he announced her situation, speaking of money owed and obligations left behind. He did not mention that she had tried to work off the debt or that she had begged for time, nor did he mention her pale, sleepless face or the thinness that hunger had carved into her frame. None of that mattered in a place where sympathy was scarce and law was sharp. Sheriff lifted her chin with a rough hand, forcing her to look at the crowd. Some faces held pity, many held judgment, but most held anticipation, as though they waited for entertainment rather than justice. Clara felt the heat of shame rise into her cheeks, but she stood straight, refusing to let her knees buckle. She would not faint or cry before these people. She had spent the last year watching her husband gamble away every coin they owned, and she had endured the long nights when he returned home shouting in defeat. Yet she had also kept trying to build a life through the ruin, sweeping floors, mending clothes, and offering whatever labor she could find. She had fought for survival every day, and she would fight again even here. Even now the bidding began in a scattered murmur. The blacksmith offered a small sum, saying she could cook for his workers. The saloon keeper lifted the price, suggesting she could serve drinks at the bar, where eyes would never stop staring at her. Clara felt her stomach twist at that thought. A ranch hand tried to offer even less, stating she did not look strong enough to be useful. A few townsfolk laughed at that, and the sound struck her like a slap, as if her value was something to be weighed and mocked in public. Sheriff called for higher bids, his tone impatient, as though she were a stubborn mule refusing to fetch a fair price. Clara forced herself to breathe. She felt the sun beating down on her shoulders, and her vision wavered, but she steadied her steps. Her heart pounded, yet she would not allow the crowd to see her fear. She kept telling herself she was more than this moment, more than the debts, more than the mistakes of a man who had never cared for her as he should have then. The murmuring stopped. A hush spread across the crowd. Clara felt it before she saw the reason. Heads turned toward the edge of the street. A tall figure approached, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who did not seek permission to exist. He was broad-shouldered, with a rugged air and clothing worn by wilderness wind and mountain snow. A scar ran along the side of his jaw, and his shadow fell over the platform like a sheltering wall. He looked at Clara for the briefest moment, and she felt something unfamiliar in his gaze, not hunger or judgment, not curiosity or cruelty, something far steadier, something that did not weigh her but saw her. The mountain man spoke only a few words, offering a sum so high the entire street gasped. He paid not the price demanded, but triple, leaving even the sheriff stunned. Clara stared at him, unable to understand why a stranger would do such a thing for a widow with nothing left to offer yet. As he stepped forward, extending a strong and steady hand, she sensed that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined, and for the first time since her husband died, she felt the faint spark of hope rising inside her, like the first warm ember in a cold winter hearth. Clara followed the mountain man through the murmuring crowd, though her steps felt unsteady and light, as if she were drifting rather than walking. People parted before him without a word, for something in his presence warned them not to stand in his way. He did not take her arm or push her forward, and he did not try to claim her as his property. Instead, he moved beside her with a quiet certainty that made her feel strangely protected. The sheriff called after him asking for signatures and records, but the mountain man simply handed over the folded bills with a steady gaze that allowed no argument when the sheriff tried to reach for Clara to confirm the transaction. The mountain man stepped between them. His voice, low yet firm as thunder, declared that there would be no chains, no ropes, and no marks placed upon her. The sheriff hesitated, then backed away, aware that this was not a man to provoke. Clara could hardly believe it. She had braced herself for rough hands and cold orders, yet none came. The man led her toward the edge of town where two horses waited. One was a strong chestnut mare, and the other carried the rugged look of a seasoned mountain trail horse. He adjusted the saddlebags, then turned to her with a calm and unreadable expression. He told her she could ride the mare, for the journey would be long and the path would not be easy. His voice was deep and steady, and it carried a warmth she had not expected from a stranger who lived beyond civilization. She tried to speak, but her throat felt tight with the weight of fear and confusion. The mountain man seemed to understand, for he did not press her for answers. Instead, he asked her simple questions such as whether she had eaten and whether she felt steady enough to ride. She admitted she had not eaten that day, and he opened a small leather pouch, offering her a piece of dried meat. The gesture surprised her, for it was the first true act of kindness she had been shown since her husband's death. She swallowed slowly, feeling the food settle in her stomach. Like a reminder that she was still alive, they mounted their horses and rode out of town, leaving behind the voices that had condemned her to humiliation. Open land stretched before them, wide and wild, with rolling hills and distant ridges rising like ancient guardians. The mountain man rode slightly ahead, guiding the way, but he never drifted far from her side. He kept glancing back to make sure she still followed, though he did so subtly. If he hoped she would not notice, Clara did notice, and each time it stirred something warm and cautious in her heart. For she had grown used to being ignored or dismissed. After an hour of riding, he slowed his horse until they were side by side. He introduced himself in a simple, quiet tone, saying his name was Coulter Ridge. She repeated the name softly, finding that it suited him, for it sounded strong and shaped by stone and earth. She told him her own name, though she spoke it with a hint of uncertainty, as if she were unsure she still deserved to claim it after everything that had happened. He nodded, as if accepting not only her words but the whole of her, and the silence that followed felt strangely comforting. Clara asked him why he had paid such an impossible sum for her. Coulter did not answer right away, for he seemed to consider every word before speaking. He finally said that he had heard the sheriff speak of her situation, and he had seen the way she stood on the platform, tall and unbroken despite the weight placed on her shoulders. He said he saw a woman who had been pushed down again and again, yet refused to collapse, and he had learned to value strength written not in muscle but in spirit. Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks, for no one had ever spoken of her that way before. They continued riding into the wild country where grass turned to pines and wind grew sharper, yet Clara no longer felt the same sinking dread. Instead, she felt something shift inside her, a fragile stirring of safety and possibility. Coulter did not claim her as a debt and did not treat her as a burden. He simply offered her a place to ride beside him, and in that small gesture she found the first hint of belonging she had felt in years. The land changed as Clara and Coulter rode farther from town, leaving behind fences, plowed fields, and the familiar creak of wagon wheels. The air sharpened and fresh. Pine rolled through the breeze, carrying the scent of distant mountains. The sky opened wide above them, a vast blue stretching farther than Clara had ever seen. She felt small in its presence, yet for the first time she did not feel trapped. She felt as though something heavy had loosened inside her, perhaps the grip of fear or the memory of the auction block fading behind her with every hoofbeat. Coulter rode with an ease she could never imitate. His shoulders remained steady and relaxed, and his large hands guided the reins as if the horse were an extension of his own body. Clara watched him from time to time, marveling at the silence he carried. It was not the silence of coldness, but the silence of someone who knew the land and respected every shift of wind and shadow. She wondered what kind of life he had lived to become so steady and so quiet. She wondered what he saw when he looked at her, a widow with debts and a past filled with struggle. The path soon narrowed into a trail leading between tall evergreens. Their branches swayed overhead and blocked some of the sunlight, allowing only thin bands of gold to spill across their way. Birds called from deep within the forest, and small animals rustled through the underbrush. Clara realized she had never ridden this far from civilization before. Her heart thumped with a mixture of excitement and worry. What if she slowed him down? What if she made mistakes? What if he regretted rescuing her from the auction? Coulter must have sensed her unease, for he slowed his horse and spoke in that steady voice that seemed shaped by stone. He told her to breathe and trust the horse, for the mare knew how to handle forest trails better than any townsfolk. Clara followed his guidance and allowed the mare to pick her way over roots and soft earth. The tension eased from her arms, and a small spark of pride rose in her chest. She was not as helpless as she had once believed. They rode until the trees thinned and a ridge came into view, revealing a valley below. The sight stole Clara's breath. The valley spread out like an untouched world, with a silver river winding through it and tall grass rippling under the breeze. Coulter paused and let her take in the view. He explained that they would descend into that valley, then climb the mountains beyond, for his home lay deep within the high country where few dared to travel. Clara listened and nodded, though she could hardly imagine a life lived so far from the noise and cruelty of town. As they continued down the ridge, clouds gathered in the distance and shadows began to move across the land. Coulter studied the sky with a thoughtful expression. Clara knew enough to recognize concern. She asked if something was wrong. He said the wind carried the smell of rain and storms moved fast in the mountains. They would need to find shelter or press onward before the trail turned slick. Clara tightened her grip on the reins and told him she could ride as far as needed. Her voice surprised even her, for it carried more strength than she expected. They pressed on with greater urgency. The wind picked up and scattered pine needles across their path. The horses snorted and flicked their ears, sensing the shift in weather. Coulter kept a close eye on Clara, making sure she did not fall behind, yet he did not hover. He trusted her enough to ride her own pace, and she appreciated that more deeply than he could have known. Her late husband had trusted nothing she did and had filled their home with doubt and blame. Now here was a man who barely knew her and yet offered her steady respect without demand. By late afternoon, the first low rumble of thunder echoed across the valley. Clara felt the vibration near her ribs, and fear curled in her stomach. She had always dreaded storms, for they reminded her of nights when the roof leaked and the walls threatened to give way. Coulter noticed her growing tension. He moved his horse closer and spoke softly, telling her that the mountains always tried to sound fiercer than they truly were, and that fear was nothing to be ashamed of. She breathed through the fear, letting his calm settle over her like a blanket as they climbed the foothills leading to the higher mountains. The storm clouds thickened and the air grew heavy. Coulter pointed ahead to a rocky overhang where they could shelter until the worst of the weather passed. Clara nodded and followed him through the rising wind. She realized that though the journey was long and uncertain, she no longer felt alone. She rode beside someone who chose to guide her, not because he owned her, but because he cared enough to make sure she reached safety. And in that moment, as thunder rolled above them, she understood that this journey was changing her in ways deeper than distance or time. Cabin appeared at the top of the ridge as the storm began to break. Its wooden walls were weathered and darkened by years of sun and wind, but the structure stood firm and strong, like it had been carved from the mountains themselves. Clara stared at it in awe, for it was unlike any home she had ever seen. There were no curtains or painted shutters, only solid logs fitted tightly together and a chimney that promised warmth inside. She felt a mix of relief and curiosity as Coulter guided the horses toward the small yard in front of the cabin. Coulter dismounted first, offering a hand to Clara, which she hesitated before taking. He stepped inside and motioned for her to follow. The interior was simple yet surprisingly welcoming. There were a few chairs and a wooden table, a small hearth with firewood stacked neatly beside it, and shelves carved into the walls holding supplies and simple tools. Clara noticed the faint smell of pine and smoke that seemed to fill the cabin with life despite its isolation. She realized that Coulter had built this place with care, not just for survival, but to make it livable for someone who might enter it as she had. He set about tending to the fire while she looked around, unsure what to do. Her hands fidgeted with the edges of her dress, and she felt the old fear of being useless rise up. Yet Coulter did not rush her. He handed her a blanket and told her to rest while he prepared something to eat. Clara obeyed, hesitantly sitting on one of the chairs and staring at the crackling flames. She had spent so long living at the mercy of men who ignored her presence that the thought of being treated with patience felt almost dizzying. Coulter spoke to her occasionally in a low voice, asking if she was hungry or if she had any skills that might help them manage the cabin. He did not demand answers or make her feel small. He seemed genuinely interested in what she could offer and what she desired to learn. Clara found herself telling him small things like how she could sew or cook, and he listened without judgment. His eyes held a quiet intensity that made her feel seen and respected in a way she had not known was possible. That night she lay on a simple cot covered with the blanket he had given her and listened to the wind whipping around the cabin. The storm had passed, but the mountains still rumbled with distant thunder. Her body ached from riding and from the tension of the past days, yet she felt a sense of security she had never experienced before. Coulter kept the fire going and occasionally checked to make sure she was warm. He did not hover or smother. He simply existed nearby as a silent guardian, and Clara realized she was beginning to trust him without fully understanding why. In the following days she learned more about the cabin and the mountain around it. She discovered a small stream where water ran clear and cold, and she helped gather wood for the fire. Coulter showed her how to check traps and gather herbs, and she marveled at how much knowledge he carried quietly in his hands and eyes. She struggled at first, feeling clumsy and unsure. Yet he encouraged her, gently correcting her when necessary and praising her for small successes. The first seeds of pride began to grow in her chest. Coulter rarely spoke of his own past, and when he did, it was in fragments and shadows. Clara respected that he did not seem to want to burden her with his history, yet she noticed the weight of something unspoken in his eyes, something sorrowful and guarded that contrasted sharply with the steady strength he carried in his actions. She felt a cautious curiosity toward him, realizing that she wanted to know the man who had saved her and yet feared the answers she might find. Meals became a quiet routine, and the cabin started to feel like a place that could be called home. Clara helped prepare simple food and arrange the few belongings he allowed her to keep inside. She realized for the first time in months that she could breathe without constant fear of judgment or ridicule. The isolation of the mountains, which had once seemed frightening, now felt protective and comforting. Coulter allowed her space yet offered guidance, always present like a steady shadow, and she began to feel that she was not only surviving but beginning to belong. By the end of the week, Clara understood that life at the cabin would be demanding, yet she also sensed that it offered her something far greater than she had expected: freedom and respect, and perhaps even the chance to become herself again under the quiet watch of a man who had paid triple to ensure her safety. She had left town humiliated and broken, but in this small cabin high in the mountains, she felt the stirrings of hope and strength for the first time since her husband's debts had cost her everything. The days settled into a rhythm as Clara grew accustomed to the quiet of the mountains. She woke with the sun and helped Coulter with the fire and the horses. The chores were hard and her muscles ached in ways she had never known, yet there was satisfaction in work done with her own hands. She learned to split wood and carry water and tend the small garden. Coulter guided her with patience, allowing her to struggle and succeed on her own. She began to feel a pride that had nothing to do with her past life or her husband's debts. Despite his rough exterior, Coulter revealed hints of a past that weighed heavily on him. He rarely spoke of it directly, but fragments surfaced in quiet moments. His voice carried a sadness that trembled just beneath the surface, and Clara could sense. He had loved and lost in ways that left scars not only on his body, but on his spirit. She did not press him for details. Though curiosity clawed at her, she felt that the man who had rescued her was also a man fighting his own ghosts, and she respected the strength it must take to survive with such burdens. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridges, Clara gathered herbs near the stream, and Coulter watched her quietly from the edge of the trees. He did not interfere, nor did he rush her when she dropped a bundle of wild mint into the basket. His gaze was steady and calm, and she felt it on her skin like the warmth of sunlight. He spoke softly about the plants and their uses for medicine and cooking, explaining each with care and patience. Clara listened attentively, absorbing every word. She realized he was teaching her more than survival. He was teaching her to trust herself again. Weeks passed. Clara's body grew stronger, and her confidence in the wilderness increased. She rode the trails with skill and checked traps with precision. She learned to predict the weather by the wind and the movement of clouds, and she marveled at the way Coulter had shaped himself into a man who could read the mountains as easily as he could read her silence. He rarely praised her, but she could sense his approval in subtle nods and brief smiles that warmed her more than any words could. Yet for all the practical skills she acquired, there remained an unspoken barrier between them. Clara sensed it in the way he avoided certain topics, and in the moments when he seemed lost in memory. She began to understand that his life had been filled with losses no one could replace, and perhaps that was why he had chosen to rescue her. She was an act of courage and generosity, not because she was beautiful or wealthy, but because she had shown strength when everyone else had mocked her. And he recognized a resilience in her spirit that mirrored his own. One night, the wind howled around the cabin and rain beat against the roof. Clara sat by the fire, mending a tear in her dress when Coulter joined her. He did not sit close at first, but merely stood by the hearth. His presence was steady as the fire, and she felt it surround her with protection. She dared to ask him why he had paid triple at the auction, and he looked down at her with eyes that seemed to measure her soul before replying. He said he had seen her standing tall while the world laughed at her, and he had recognized a courage he could not ignore. That was all he would say, yet the words were enough to make her heart swell with a mixture of gratitude and wonder. Clara began to notice small things about him that softened the rough edges she had assumed were permanent. She saw the care he took with his tools and his horses, and the way he moved through the woods with respect for every living thing. She realized that beneath the gruff exterior there was a man who understood patience and responsibility in ways the townspeople could not conceive. She felt an unfamiliar warmth for him, but also a caution, for she did not want to risk the fragile trust that had been built by the end of the 5th week. Clara had changed. She was no longer the timid widow who had been dragged across the auction block. She was strong and capable and aware of her own worth. She still carried the memories of shame and loss, but they no longer defined her. Mountains and the cabin and the quiet presence of Coulter had given her a chance to reclaim herself, to learn that survival was not only about living, but about finding strength and hope. Even after everything had been taken away, Clara woke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the cabin window. The storm from the previous night had passed, leaving the mountains bathed in gold and mist. Rising from her cot, she felt the ache in her muscles from days of work, yet the soreness was different now. It was the mark of strength, not weakness. She dressed quickly and joined Coulter outside, where the horses nickered softly in the morning chill. The air smelled of pine and wet earth, and for the first time in months she felt a calm that had nothing to do with fear. Coulter handed her the reins of the chestnut mare and nodded toward the trail that led deeper into the mountains. She mounted with a steadying breath and followed him as they navigated narrow ridges and rushing streams. The terrain was rugged and her legs burned with effort, yet she felt alive. in a way that she had not known in the crowded streets of town. Every hoofbeat and step brought a sense of freedom that seemed to stretch beyond the mountains into the very core of her being. As they rode, Coulter spoke little, but his glances told her more than words could convey. He was alert to every movement of the forest, and to her steadiness on the horse, and she realized that he had grown to trust her in a way no one ever had. Trust that was not given lightly, for he had survived alone in this wilderness and had lost much to it. The quiet acknowledgement of her skill and courage made her chest swell with a mix of pride and gratitude. She felt herself becoming someone new, someone who could endure hardship and even find joy in it. By mid-morning they reached a plateau, overlooking a small meadow where wildflowers swayed in the wind. The sight made Clara catch her breath, and she could not resist dismounting to explore. The earth was soft beneath her boots, and the fragrance of the flowers mingled with the crisp mountain air. Coulter stayed close, but gave her the space to wander. She knelt to examine the plants, picking a few and tucking them into her pocket to dry later for teas or poultices. The small act of collecting something useful for their cabin felt empowering, and she realized that she had never felt so capable in her life. Later they made their way to a shallow creek where Coulter showed her how to set small traps for fish and gather water for the cabin. He guided her hands at first, then stepped back, allowing her to complete the tasks herself. She marveled at how much she had learned in so few days, and how her body had adjusted to the rhythm of the mountains. She had grown stronger and sharper, and even the exhaustion of the day felt like a reward rather than a burden as the sun began to dip behind the distant ridges. They made camp near a clump of pines. Coulter built a small fire and handed Clara a bowl of food. She ate quietly, watching the flames dance and feeling the heat seep into her chilled fingers. She noticed for the first time the gentleness in Coulter's movements, the way he fed the horses and carefully tended the fire, as if each action carried respect for life itself. There was a steadiness to him that made her feel anchored in the wilderness rather than adrift that night. As they lay under the shelter of a lean-to, Clara felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The mountains stretched endlessly around them, and the stars shone bright and close. She realized that living in this wilderness with Coulter was transforming her. She was no longer defined by her past or by the debts left by a husband who had failed her. She had her own strength, her own worth, and she felt for the first time that she could face whatever came without fear. In the quiet moments before sleep, she turned her gaze to Coulter, who was arranging the horses for the night. His profile was strong and rugged, yet there was softness in the set of his shoulders and in the careful way he moved through the camp. She wondered about the losses that had shaped him, the pain that must have made him so solitary, and yet she felt a spark of understanding that perhaps their wounds mirrored each other in some small way. They were both survivors, and in that recognition she sensed the beginning of a bond, not built on need or ownership, but on respect and shared endurance, and she knew that this journey had only just begun. The peace of the mountains did not last long, for one morning as Clara tended the horses, she spotted movement along the ridge above the cabin. Her heart skipped at first, thinking it might be deer, but the shapes were too deliberate, too purposeful, and soon she realized with a chill that they were men armed with rifles. Their eyes scanned the area, and a familiar dread settled over her. She had never imagined the debts and cruelty of the town would follow her into the wilderness, and yet here they were claiming she still belonged to them in some twisted sense. Clara froze, unsure of what to do, but Coulter was already moving. He emerged from the cabin as if the land itself had given him warning. His presence was commanding and calm at the same time. He did not shout, nor did he wave his hands. He simply assessed the men with eyes that measured distance and intent. Then he called to Clara to stay back, and she obeyed, her body trembling, though her mind felt sharper than ever. She watched him move like a predator through the open space, positioning himself between her and the intruders. The men called out, demanding she be returned, claiming that the debts were not fully paid. Coulter did not respond immediately. Instead, he tightened his grip on his rifle and took a step forward. His stance made it clear that he would not allow harm to come to her. They hesitated for a moment, as if realizing they were facing more than just a mountain man. They had underestimated the wilderness and underestimated the one who had chosen to protect the woman they sought to claim. Clara felt fear curl in her stomach, yet also an unexpected rush of courage. She had learned to ride hard through the forest to gather water and to tend traps, all under Coulter's guidance, and now she understood that she was not powerless. She could see the calculations in his eyes and the control in his movements, and she felt that she was part of this defense, not simply someone to be protected, but someone who could act and think and survive. The confrontation escalated. As one of the men advanced a step too far, Coulter's rifle rose swiftly, and with a calm voice he warned them once to retreat. The echo of his words carried through the trees, and the men froze. The silence of the mountains pressed around them as if waiting for the next move. The tension was unbearable, yet Clara noticed that Coulter's hands did not shake. His eyes did not waver, and his body radiated the certainty of someone who had survived far greater dangers than these petty outlaws. Finally, the men began to back away, their confidence crumbling under the weight of Coulter's presence. They exchanged harsh whispers and glanced nervously at the slopes, knowing they were outmatched and perhaps outsmarted. They retreated down the ridge, leaving the rifles and threats behind for now, but the memory of the encounter lingered in the air like smoke. Clara exhaled a breath she did not realize she had been holding. Her knees felt weak, yet she also felt an unfamiliar thrill coursing through her veins. She had seen the power of protection and courage firsthand. After the danger passed, Coulter turned to her. His expression was unreadable for a moment, and then softened slightly. He asked if she was unharmed, and when she nodded, he placed a firm hand on her shoulder, not in possessiveness but in reassurance. Clara felt a shiver run through her. Yet it was not fear, but a mixture of gratitude and something tender and unspoken. She realized that the wilderness had not only taught her survival, but had revealed the depth of Coulter's character and the lengths he would go to keep her safe. At night, as they sat by the fire, Clara could not help but think about the men who had come. She understood now that the world outside the mountains was cruel and relentless, yet she also knew that she had a protector who would not allow her to be taken. She felt a growing sense of strength and determination within herself. The outlaws had tested her fear and Coulter's resolve, but they had also ignited a spark in her own courage, and she realized that she was becoming someone who could face the world and the mountains together, with him by her side. That night the fire crackled in the cabin and shadows danced across the walls. Clara sat on the floor near the hearth, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of herbal tea. She watched Coulter move quietly, tending the horses and checking the traps outside. His presence was steady and calming, and yet the events of the day left her mind restless. She could not shake the memory of the outlaws, nor the way Coulter had faced them with unwavering strength. She realized that she had questions burning inside her, questions she had kept buried beneath layers of fear and shame. Finally, gathering courage, she asked him why he had paid triple at the auction, why he had taken her from the hands of those who saw her only as a commodity. Coulter paused and studied the fire for a long moment before answering. His voice was quiet and deliberate. He said he had seen her standing tall when everyone else had mocked her. He had seen the refusal to break the way. She had met shame and humiliation without surrendering her spirit. He admitted that it was rare to witness such strength in a person, especially someone so young and alone. Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. She had never been seen in that way before. Never had anyone recognized her endurance or her courage. She had spent so long believing her worth was tied to her late husband's failures or to the judgments of the townspeople. Now here was a man who valued her for herself, who recognized the fire that had kept her upright despite everything. Realization made her eyes sting, though she did not cry, for she had learned to control her emotions, to face the world without breaking. Coulter continued speaking, telling her that he did not see her as property nor as someone to be rescued simply to repay a debt. He saw a woman who had fought to remain, unbroken despite the cruelty and neglect of a world that had demanded she surrender. He said that strength was rare and precious, and that she deserved to have someone in her corner to acknowledge it and to respect it. Clara listened intently, feeling the weight of his words settle over her like a shield. For the first time, she felt she could speak honestly about her fears and doubts. She admitted that she had feared being powerless, that she had believed she was nothing without her husband's presence. She told him that the auction had left her feeling stripped of dignity and hope. Coulter did not interrupt or dismiss her. He simply nodded and let her speak, trusting that she needed to release the burden of her past. She felt a strange relief in sharing her thoughts aloud, as if the mountains themselves had created a space where her voice could matter. The firelight flickered across his face, and she noticed for the first time the softness hidden beneath his rugged features. Scars and roughness did not diminish his care or attention. They were part of him, as her own marks and losses were part of her. Together they formed a silent understanding that did not need to be rushed or explained fully. They were survivors who had met at the crossroads of loss and strength, and in that recognition lay a fragile yet growing connection. Clara realized that she trusted him not because she owed him anything nor because she was obliged, but because he had chosen her freely. He had seen her value without demand or judgment, and that choice carried more weight than any words or gifts could. She felt a small spark of hope in her chest, a tentative light that maybe the mountains were not only a refuge from danger, but a place where she could learn to be seen and valued for who she truly was. By the end of the night, she understood that her journey with Coulter was no longer just about survival. It was about understanding her own worth and discovering the possibility of connection built on respect and recognition. She curled up near the fire, feeling warmth and safety, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine a life where she could be more than a widow, more than a debtor, and perhaps even more than she had ever dreamed. The weeks that followed brought a sense of routine to the cabin, yet the memory of the outlaws lingered like a shadow over Clara and Coulter. The mountains seemed calm on most days, but the threat of danger reminded them that their isolation was both a blessing and a challenge. Clara rose with the sun and tended the cabin, preparing food, fetching water, and checking the traps, while Coulter worked alongside her, teaching her the skills he had mastered over years of living in the wilderness. She moved with a confidence she had never known before, and each task completed made her feel stronger and more capable. One afternoon, as they prepared to repair a section of the cabin roof, a group of outlaws returned. This time in greater numbers. They had tracked the trail through the forest, expecting to claim Clara and perhaps take revenge on the mountain man who had defied them. Coulter assessed the situation quickly and silently. His eyes scanned the ridge, and his hands adjusted the weapons and tools he carried. Clara felt her stomach tighten, yet she refused to step back. She had learned much in the mountains, and she was not the frightened widow from the auction anymore. She mounted her horse and followed his lead with steady resolve. The confrontation escalated quickly. The outlaws shouted threats, but Coulter positioned himself to block their path. He warned them once and again, but they advanced thinking they could intimidate him. Their arrogance and underestimation of the terrain and Coulter's skill became apparent when he moved with precision and decisiveness. Clara realized that she was watching a man in his element, one who had survived countless storms and losses and yet still carried the ability to protect another human being with unwavering focus. Clara felt her heart pounding, yet she also felt an unfamiliar surge of courage. She had learned to read the land, to anticipate movement, to react quickly. She helped secure the horses and gathered supplies that could be used in the event they needed to defend themselves. Her mind was alert and every sense heightened by the danger. She was no longer passive. She was part of the strategy, and her own competence added strength to Coulter's defense. The outlaws realized they were outmatched and began to retreat, their confidence faltering in the face of Coulter's steady presence and the knowledge that Clara was not helpless. They withdrew down the ridge, leaving threats behind for the moment. But their intent remained clear. They might return, but they had underestimated the wilderness and underestimated the bond forming between the mountain man and the woman he had saved. Clara exhaled deeply, feeling both relief and exhilaration at having faced the threat and survived after the outlaws left. Coulter turned to her. His expression was serious, yet softened by the recognition of her growing strength. He told her she had done well, that she had faced fear without surrender and had proven herself capable of acting when needed. Clara felt a rush of pride mixed with a warmth she could not name. She realized that the bond between them had deepened through shared trial, and that trust had been cemented by survival and mutual respect. That night by the fire, Clara reflected on the events of the day. She understood that the mountains had changed her more than she had realized. She was no longer the woman defined by her husband's debts or by public shame. She had grown stronger, braver, and more self-reliant. She had faced danger alongside Coulter and discovered the depth of her own courage. Mountain Man, who had paid triple for her presence, had revealed himself as a protector, a teacher, and perhaps something more. She felt a cautious hope that the future could hold more than survival, that it could hold freedom and respect, and even a connection built on choice and trust. As the stars filled the sky above the cabin, Clara allowed herself to imagine what life might be like beyond fear and shame. She saw herself riding through the mountains with Coulter beside her, learning new skills and facing challenges together. She felt the spark of something tender growing between them, a bond forged in danger and strengthened by shared endurance. In that quiet moment, she understood that she was no longer a widow defined by loss. She was a woman transformed by the mountains, by survival, and by the mountain man who had chosen her freely. Winter settled over the mountains with a quiet hush and a blanket of snow that turned the world into silver and white. Clara watched it from the cabin window, her breath fogging the glass as she considered how far she had come since the auction block. The fear and shame that had haunted her seemed distant, now replaced by strength and the certainty that she could survive anything. The mountains had tested her, had shaped her, and had introduced her to a man whose presence had become more important than she could have imagined. Coulter moved around the cabin, preparing firewood and checking the horses. His movements were methodical and careful, and Clara noticed the gentle precision in the way he handled every task. She felt a warmth rise in her chest that had nothing to do with the cold outside. The man who had paid triple to save her had taught her more than survival. He had taught her respect, had shown her her own worth, and had offered her protection without ever demanding anything in return. That evening, as the wind howled across the ridge, Coulter approached her carrying 2 mugs of steaming tea. He offered one silently, and she accepted, her fingers brushing his as she held it. The simple contact sent a spark through her that she could not deny. She realized that her feelings had grown beyond gratitude. She had come to rely on his presence, to feel steady and safe, to feel that she belonged somewhere and with someone. They sat together in silence, allowing the fire to fill the room with warmth and light. Clara finally found the courage to speak. Her voice was low and tentative, yet full of honesty. She told him that she had never felt seen before, that she had spent years being overlooked, judged, and dismissed, and that his choice to save her had changed her life. He listened without interruption, allowing her words to settle between them like precious stones. Coulter placed a hand on hers and spoke softly, for the first time, of what she had meant to him from the moment he saw her. He admitted that her strength had struck him and that he had recognized a courage that few possessed. He said he had paid triple because he believed she was worth far more than anyone else had understood. He told her that she was more than a widow, more than a debtor, and more than anyone had ever given her credit for. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being understood and valued. She realized that the mountains had given her a second chance, a chance to reclaim herself and to discover a life built on respect, trust, and choice. She had survived the auction, the threats, and the wilderness, and she had emerged stronger, braver, and capable of loving. Again Coulter drew her into his arms, holding her with a strength that was protective yet gentle. His voice was low and certain as he repeated the words that had carried her through fear and doubt. "You're worth it." Clara felt the weight of those words settle into her bones. She realized that she was free to choose her life, free to love without fear, and free to stand beside someone who respected her as an equal. The mountain man who had paid triple for her had given her far more than protection. He had given her dignity, freedom, and the promise of a life where she could belong. Winter deepened outside, yet the cabin glowed with warmth and light. Clara and Coulter sat together watching the fire, knowing that the mountains would always test them, but that together they could endure anything. She felt a joy she had never known, a love that was earned, not forced, and a certainty that her life had been transformed not by chance, but by the choice of a man who had seen her worth and valued it beyond measure. The auction, the shame, the debts, all faded behind her, leaving only the mountains and him and the life they would build together.